So, can even the most powerful nation, maybe without realizing it, actually set its own limits?
That's a fascinating question, isn't it? This paradox.
Right. And today we're digging into that, looking at U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War, mainly through the lens of Andrew Bacevich's book, The Limits of Power.
A really insightful critique.
Yeah, exactly. We want to give you a clearer path through this, complex history and what it means now.
And help make sense of it all.
And speaking of making sense of things, we should also mention Mindful Moments. It's a YouTube channel using AI for book analysis. It really sparks some critical thinking on big topics like this one.
Oh, that's interesting. Tools like that can be really helpful.
Definitely. Okay, so post-Cold War, America as the sole superpower, that idea really took hold, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just like nationalistic bragging. It was pretty much conventional wisdom across the board: economic, political, cultural, military dominance. Unquestioned.
So everyone just sort of accepted it, this total dominance.
Pretty much. And the thinking was, okay, now we manage this global empire. But that focus, it came at a price, didn't it?
You mean focusing outwards meant neglecting things at home? Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. This preoccupation with managing the world meant basic homeland defense wasn't really prioritized. Before 9/11, protecting the U.S. itself, it sort of lacked clear ownership, resources too.
I see. Then, of course, 9/11 changes everything. Or does it? How did that reshape America's view of its role?
Well, yes and no. The Bush administration definitely reacted strongly, but in many ways it just doubled down on that core belief American exceptionalism, the U.S. setting the rules.
But with a difference.
A key difference, yeah.
Yeah.
A much greater willingness to use force, especially in the Islamic world, to assert that role.
Which leads us into this concept of the long war. What did that actually mean in practice?
It meant framing the fight against terror as this generational thing. Decades, maybe even a century of engagement. Forget exit strategies. This was about sustained, open-ended involvement, no deadlines.
Wow. Okay, now Bacevich brings up Reinhold Niebuhr and this American obsession with freedom. It sounds like a good thing, but how could it be a weakness?
Yeah, Niebuhr pointed out this almost religious reverence for freedom in America. It's not really debated. It's just accepted, sacred almost.
Okay.
The paradox or the tension comes in how we pursue freedom. At home, it often means more consumption, more individual choice, right?
Sure, that makes sense.
But that very pursuit, that consumer focus, might actually undermine the nation's ability to stick with these long, costly foreign wars.
So, wait, the freedom we value at home makes it harder to project power abroad long term.
That's the argument Bacevich explores. Defending American freedom seemed to demand military action overseas, but living that freedom domestically, the economic choices, the political pressures could actually create vulnerabilities, making those long wars harder to sustain.
That's quite a paradox, and it connects to this idea of hubris, right? Believing America is infallible.
Exactly. A sort of lack of realism, maybe. A lack of humility. It fostered this belief that American values were universal, and that the U.S. could and should remake the world in its image.
And that mindset fueled these open-ended wars.
It certainly contributed. Robert Kagan had that quote, something like, "America did not change on September 11. It only became more itself." Meaning 9/11 just hardened the resolve to protect the American way of life, using that same framework.
But Bacevich pushes back hard on this, saying the ambition crashed against reality, the actual limits of American power. What's his core point there?
The absolute core is that the U.S. just didn't have the resources, economic, political, maybe even social, to wage this kind of global indefinite war without hurting itself badly.
So the empire idea was built on shaky foundations.
You could say that. The grand bazaar, as he calls American consumerism, isn't really a solid base for running an empire. It ties back to Niebuhr's warning about civilizations getting really pretentious right when decay starts setting in. Bacevich suggests maybe that applies here to the U.S. in its long war.
And for him, the Iraq War is the prime example of all this coming together.
Yes, absolutely. He sees Iraq as the clearest case, where the economic, political, and military crises all intersected and became obvious.
How so?
Well, he argues the war was just unnecessary, counterproductive, and ultimately couldn't be sustained. And the irony, perhaps, is that Iraq might have shown the futility of relying only on military might, forcing a look at, problems back home.
Okay, let's shift slightly. There's this popular story about America having a great liberating tradition driving its foreign policy. Bacevich questions that.
He challenges it strongly. He argues that if you look historically, expansion wanting more territory, more commercial reach, has been a much more consistent driver than pure altruism.
So it wasn't always about freeing others.
Not primarily, according to his analysis. Expansion was often achieved through various means, sometimes pragmatic, sometimes opportunistic, not always noble or liberating in intent or effect.
He mentions things like annexing the Philippines or Vietnam. How does he think we remember those?
He suggests that while we know about them, we tend to downplay their implications. We sort of gloss over how they complicate that simple, liberating tradition narrative, sticking to a more idealized picture.
So if it wasn't idealism driving success, what was it? What made American foreign policy work when it did?
Bacevich points to boldness, sure, but combined with pragmatism, and often a healthy dose of opportunism. Less about a grand, idealistic strategy, more about seizing chances when they arose. Think of the most effective statesmen.
Interesting. Okay, let's jump to the post-World War II era, the golden age of American power. What gave the U.S. such an edge then?
Oh, the advantages were just immense. Most of the world's gold reserves, unmatched manufacturing, huge export surpluses, the dollar becoming the global currency. It fueled incredible growth, the rise of the middle class.
A period of real prosperity. And we've touched on similar historical moments in our other conversations, and you can find related analyses on mindful moments too. Understanding these ups and downs really helps frame today's issues.
Absolutely. Context is key. But even in that golden age, the seeds of future problems were there, weren't they?
You mean vulnerabilities were already showing?
Yeah, things like the growing dependence on foreign oil started relatively early. And then the sheer cost of the Vietnam War really began to destabilize the economy. It put a huge strain on things.
Which leads to different presidential responses. Carter versus Reagan, for instance.
Right. Carter saw the writing on the wall, this dependence, and called for, well, austerity. A different way of thinking about freedom, maybe less about just consuming things.
And Reagan.
Reagan went the other way, embraced spending, the empire of consumption. The focus shifted to using military strength to guarantee access to resources, especially oil, rather than actually cutting back on using them.
And that had ripple effects, like in Afghanistan.
Definitely unintended consequences. Supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That seemed smart then. But after the Soviet collapse, and later 9/11, suddenly Central Asia becomes strategically vital because of that earlier involvement. And U.S. military engagement there just continued. It fits the expansionist pattern.
So all this feeds into what Bacevich calls the ideology of national security. Can you break that down? What are its main tenets?
Sure. It rests on a few core beliefs. 1, American freedom is basically a universal good. 2, the U.S. is the main example, the leader of this freedom. 3, for America itself to be secure, this freedom needs to spread everywhere.
And this ideology justifies?
It provides the rationale for strong executive power, for military intervention around the globe, often without very specific goals or end dates. And importantly, it doesn't necessarily stop the U.S. from working with authoritarian regimes if it suits the purpose.
And it's pervasive. Even politicians who might seem different end up adopting it.
Bacevich points out how even figures like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, when running for office, essentially had to affirm this ideology to prove they were serious about national security.
Wow. And this thinking has been shaped by specific groups, these wise men figures over the decades.
Yes. Since WWII, there's been this kind of self-selecting foreign policy elite. Bacevich contrasts early figures like Henry Simpson with later ones like James Forstall, suggesting a shift towards a more alarmist, more militarized view among advisors.
Like Paul Nitze.
Exactly. Paul Nitze and NSC 68 are key examples. That document really pushed for permanent, massive militarization, arguably by exaggerating the Soviet threat. Fear-mongering, Bacevich suggests.
And that pattern continued.
He argues it did. Think of the bomber gap, the missile gap, later the Rumsfeld Commission hyping threats. This pattern of elites amplifying dangers to justify military buildup seems persistent.
Which kind of sets the scene for the post-9/11 Bush doctrine and preventive war. What was the thinking there?
Well, people like Paul Wolfowitz, influential in the Bush administration, really pushed for this idea of anticipatory self-defense, basically hitting potential threats before they could fully emerge, preventive war.
And Iraq was supposed to be the showcase.
The belief, or maybe the hope, was that Iraq would be quick, easy, a cakewalk was the term used. It would prove the doctrine right and show that the U.S. could use its military power without constraint when it chose to.
But reality, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't quite match that belief.
Not at all. That whole post-Cold War dream of a new American way of war, precise, humane, almost surgical, it just evaporated.
How so?
Well, the illusion of a perfect all-volunteer force, the belief in this new civil-military compact, it all got exposed. The simple, low-tech effectiveness of things like IEDs against the most sophisticated military in the world was a brutal lesson. It showed the real limits of military power, however advanced.
So what were the wrong lessons to take from that experience, according to Bacevich?
He's critical of the idea that the main takeaway should be, okay, the military just needs to get better at counterinsurgency or nation building. Or that the answer is just giving generals more power or even bringing back the draft.
Why is that the wrong focus?
Because for him, those are tactical adjustments. They don't address the core strategic problem, which he sees as the pursuit of these unrealistic, frankly, imperial ambitions in the first place. Trying to fix the tools won't help if the overall job you're trying to do is flawed.
It sounds like he's bringing it back to some fundamental truths about war itself.
Absolutely. Ancient truths, really. War is messy, unpredictable, hard to control no matter how much power you think you have. The IED is a perfect, if grim, example of how seeming superiority can be undermined.
And the nation-building failures.
Just further proof. Trying to remake entire societies in Iraq and Afghanistan, the limits were starkly revealed.
So the ultimate conclusion isn't about better tactics, but a different strategy altogether.
Precisely. Bacevich argues for abandoning the whole strategy of trying to dominate or transform the Islamic world. Instead, pursue goals that are actually achievable and affordable. And, crucially, turn attention inward. Confront the dysfunction at home instead of constantly looking for military solutions abroad.
Right. So we've traced this arc from the illusion of limitless power after the Cold War, through the hubris and the Long War, the challenge to the liberating tradition narrative, the economic pressures, and finally the harsh lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan about the very real limits of power.
It's a sobering analysis.
It really is. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. Has this decades-long pursuit of global dominance, this attempt to shape the world, actually made America less strong, less secure?
A powerful question to consider.
Definitely something to think about. We hope this conversation gave you some valuable insights. Please subscribe for more discussions like this and share it if you found it useful.
And if you want to go deeper, check out Andrew Bacevich's The Limits of Power. There should be a link where you found this conversation.
Most importantly, keep thinking critically about these complex issues and what they mean for the world we live in. Thanks for joining us.